archive is located in the Michaelis School of Fine Arts here at the University of Cape Town. So, as an introduction, it is perhaps fitting to cite that the CCA has worked actively with different kinds of physical collections to develop curatorship as a creative site of knowledge production. Archival and curatorial practice are core research activities of our work. It recognizes these as fundamental to both the conservation of collections through the high-quality digital documentation of collections, for example, and making them accessible to artists, scholars, and students via the web, publications, exhibitions, and public events. Projects, publications, and courses aim through practice to open up novel combinations of the historically separated domains of the creative arts and the truth-making discourses of history and the social and natural sciences. Spirals draws on the CCA's long-standing interest in the nature of Spirals draws on the CCA's long-standing interest in the nature of archive and the curatorial as a programmed set of conversations and conceptions, configurations, and representations of art and the curatorial and the archival. The title Spirals is as peculiar as it is purposeful. Peculiar because it is a metaphor of fierce, perhaps even destructive circulation, evoking images of hurricanes, whirlpools, and vortices, and perhaps even incendiary, a kind of incendiary metaphor that we will now have to sit with the remnants of which we have to sit with. Purposeful in that it is the possibilities of disorder, but also renewal presented by such a metaphor that we find especially productive. The spiral therefore provides the possibility for conceptually sweeping across the linearities that structure our basic assumptions about archive, art, the academy, and the curatorial. Circulating these conversations are spaces of shifting and sharing perspectives on crucial yet common questions about the nature of archive and the practice and work of the curatorial. Our conversations will therefore open a way of thinking about relations of time, not as trajectories, but as cycles, and foreground the potential of return and recursivity rather than evolution and progress. They will present ways of considering systems of classification as being open to declassification and reconstitution, and they will consider relations of the human and non-human and natural orders. We convene in virtual space online between Berlin and Cape Town. This has been made possible in part due to the effects of the pernicious airborne virus that has upended our personal lives, our relationships, our professional worlds. And here in South Africa, we are still keenly waiting on the arrival of the vaccine. We've been challenged to sit with and work through the discomforting questions of what scholarly work means in these extraordinary times. And so today's talk is timely in a complicated set of ways. We want to emphasize this third space so as to abandon with any false assumptions about our speakers coming in and conveying lessons, so to say, as if the scholarly, artistic, and curatorial work being done in Berlin is at the vanguard that those in the global south should passively absorb. Certainly, Berlin is a major global hub of artistic and scholarly work, but in many ways so is Cape Town, South Africa, and the African continent more generally. The format and framing of our talk is designed to cycle our participants out of fixed asymmetrical scholarly positions. These conversations are meant to enrich our perspectives here at the University of Cape Town, but also meant to challenge those of our speakers to contribute to them thinking differently about what they consider important. We have seen this dynamic in our previous talks with some of the other speakers that we've had come in for Spirals. And you can visit our website to see some of the recordings of those talks. We therefore meet as a community of learning with different views brought to bear on a shared set of questions about the nature of archive, artistic practice, and the curatorial, and the assumed stakes and investments that attach to those. Hopefully, a sense of convergence and divergence of mutual interest, but distinct stakes and investments around a set of exciting current ideas in our respective fields will emerge and generate stimulating, mutually beneficial insights that can advance the intellectual and artistic enterprise as a whole. Our session is titled Metadata Politics. Here we explore the politics, tensions, tensions and ethics of digital data inscription, particularly but not exclusively in the museum setting. Some of the questions we will explore in this particular session have come up in some of the background conversations that our speakers and discussants have had so far. These include how we deal with the complexities of the politics of metadata, insofar as when data capturers actually make the choices as to when a piece of information that is about to be captured is too sensitive to be made public, what information should be captured and what information should be left behind, and how those kinds of decisions are actually made. Rigid data models don't provide sufficient contextualizing data for the kinds of evidentiary reading that humanities scholarship requires. So there's a question of different languages of data capturing and data presentation. So this will also be one of the themes that we'll be exploring. And finally, if digitization processes always require a choice, since not everything should be made digital, is it worth considering these politics as a factor in making these choices? So principally, we're circulating around the tension of making information accessible, but also being sensitive to the politics of the context in which that information was generated in the very first place. So we are very excited to host Dr. Rebecca Kahn for this session. She is a Rewire postdoctoral researcher in the Digital Humanities Group at the University of Vienna. Her project explores how museums and archives are using the semantic web to build integrated collections and the ethical and technological challenges presented by current data models. She's also an associate researcher at the Humboldt Institute for Internet and Society in Berlin, where she worked on several linked data for cultural heritage projects. Her previous research has explored the intersections of heritage digitization and national identity narratives in South Africa, Wales and Britain, and the formation of memory in both the British Museum and the Schwulist Museum, Berlin. She completed undergrad and postgraduate studies at Rhodes University and BITS, and a PhD at King's College London. Her talk, based on a soon-to-be-published article, is titled Man, Woman, Other. It is concerned with the ethics and politics of museum metadata. This is not immediately evident in museum collections, although arguably every object in a museum accumulates embedded and encoded politics at each phase of its journey into the collection and after. Digitization can expose these politics as ever larger virtual infrastructures promise interconnected and interlinked access to heritage collections online. On the one hand, these technologies have the potential to reunite scattered collections, democratize access, and reveal hidden narratives. On the other, they also risk adding complicated, outdated, inaccurate metadata into the data ecosystem without providing corresponding contextual information. The talk will consider a small collection of drawings made by children, which were collected by a pioneering female anthropologist and are now part of the collection at the Pitt Rivers Museum of Anthropology and World Archaeology at the University of Oxford. This case study demonstrates how difficult metadata, usually buried deep in museum documentation, is brought to the surface by digitization and exposes the traumatic histories of a collection's origins. We are delighted to have both Deborah Pryor and Chloe Rasovich, both of which who are digital archival content managers at the 500-year archive digital project, and both research associates at the Archive and Public Culture Research Initiative. As our discussants, they will come in at the very end. And at this point, I would also like to say we are humbled that the CCA can host this, as it is also the last day of formal employment of our director at the CCA, Pippa Scottness, who I think is in session. Pippa, are you with us here? Would you like to say a few words before we kick off the session?
I think Pippa is still doing library salvaging, Dwayne.
Okay, Pippa's not here, but Pippa is here with us in spirit as the director of the CCA. So it's kind of an auspicious session, especially since we hold a very precious and special archive, the Bleak and Lloyd archive. And the Bleak and Lloyd archive has been a lifelong project of purpose, the digitization, the organizing, the capturing, and the publication of the Bleak and Lloyd archive. So it's very fitting for us to be thinking about metadata politics today. And not only as to the archives that we actually have, but also thinking about the reconstitution of our African Studies Library going forward. So thank you very much for everyone who is joining. And now I will hand over the stage to you, Rebecca. Thank you so much for zooming into us from Berlin.
Thank you, Dwayne. It's it's such a pleasure to be here. It really is. And firstly, thank you for the invitation. And to the CCA for having me. It's a great honor to be here. The work by the CCA and by scholars who are part of the CCA has been absolutely integral to the kind of formation of my interests and the work that I've done. And there are, I think, certain people who are here today who I think I can blame my academic career on. So thank you. I wouldn't be here without you. And also to Deborah and Chloe, we've had some brief discussions. I'm really excited about the conversations that we're going to have after this session. I know it's been a really difficult time for the UCT community, and I really appreciate all of you taking the time to be here. It's very generous, and I hope we have an interesting conversation. I'm going to try and share my screen with all of you. I hope I get this right. One second. Right, can you all see a bunch of slides?
Yeah, that's visible, I can see it.
Excellent, great, glad to hear it. Let's try and make it nice and big. And we can continue. So yeah, as Dwayne mentioned, the discussion I'm going to be having today, or the work I'm going to present to you today, is based on a paper which will be coming out in Digital Culture and Society in June, and is based on some work that myself and I can't take the credit for this. I worked with a group of other very experienced and insightful data scientists and museum curators at a workshop in Berlin in 2019. And what I'm hoping to explore in this session is look at what happens when digging into one set of politics around a collection of metadata actually ends up leading to an encounter with another set of, I would argue, much more complex politics, and how that challenges us as researchers and as scholars and as museum and archive professionals to think about what's sitting in the collections and how we deal with it. As Dwayne also said, I'm going to be using a small collection of drawings from the Pitt Rivers Museum of Anthropology in Oxford. And the reason for this is that this was the material that we were provided with at the workshop, which I'll describe in a moment. The Pitt Rivers Museum very generously gave us access to their entire database, which is not an unrisky thing for a museum to do. And so what I'm hoping to show with this case study is how the politics around museum metadata, once we sort of elevate it out of the collection through the process of digitization, both enriches our experiences of the objects, but also simultaneously exposes the trauma of a collection's origins. And in an increasingly digital future, I think the pressure is on all of us, or the onus is on all of us, to think very carefully about these topics. When I talk about the politics of metadata in this context, I take a cue from Mark Cote, Paulo Gabardo, and Jennifer Pybus's argument that big data is political in the same way that identity or the body, gender, sexuality, race, and ethnicity are political. And that is that they are sites of struggles over meaning, interpretation, and categorizations of lived experiences. My position is that metadata, not that differently from big data, should be understood as a similar site of struggle, since scholars like Lisa Gittelman and others have told us that data, and metadata in particular, is never and can never be said to be neutral because of the choices that are made in the creation of this data. So as I said, this piece of work started out at a workshop in 2019, and it was a joint project between the Technical University of Berlin, where really interesting work is happening around provenance of ethnographic museum collections. The Pitt-Rivers Museum in Oxford and Sciences Po in Paris. So we really did bring the theoretical, the museum and the data science aspects together. We were given access to the entire collections database of the Pitt-Rivers Museum, which was about 300,000 records spread across 31 different information fields, and about two external hard drives. And what makes the Pitt-Rivers a particularly interesting collection to work with in this context is that it has unusually high quality records for a museum that is as old as it is and that has varied a set of materials as it holds. And what we were challenged to do in this workshop was to ask difficult questions about data. So questions around provenance, for example, around ownership, around trends and bias, comparative questions, and interpretive questions of the materials that we were presented with. And we really were encouraged to take the kind of quick and dirty approach, which is you've got a bunch of data, how quickly can you put something together that could be a jumping off point for a deeper investigation into the data? So we really did a lot of crunching of numbers over about 3 days. And for the curators from the Pitt-Rivers who were part of the group, these were the sorts of questions that came up, questions around the gaps in the records, how these gaps may have entered into the records, had information been available and not recorded, or had it never been recorded. The question of makers was central to what our group worked on, because one of the real focus areas for the Pitt-Rivers at the moment is to try and locate as much as possible the names of the makers of the materials that had been collected over the years. And oftentimes what they have found is that while the name of a collector is prioritized, the name of a maker often isn't. So what we had to do was try and take these curatorial questions and translate them into data-driven questions. And that involved a lot of data science stuff that I didn't really understand at the time, but lots of looking for groups of data, comparing it, refining it, looking for correlations and non-correlations, and asking very specific questions, because obviously a computer can't ask a generalized question. You have to tell it exactly what to look for. So we decided to focus particularly on the naming of makers and see if we could find a way of inquiring of the data whether there were any trends that we could find between when male anthropologists and female anthropologists were collecting materials, whether one group was more or less likely to provide names for the makers, and also whether there was any correlation between where those materials were collected. Was there more of a trend towards naming makers when those materials were collected in North America, perhaps, rather than when they were collected in Oceania? And these were very broad questions, which we had to kind of dig into the data to try and answer. And after 3 days, this is what we found, that only 4.9% of the objects in the Pitt-Rivers collection have a named maker. And of the thousands of collectors who have provided materials, only 535 of those collectors provided names. And when we started filtering those field collectors to try and get a little bit more detail of who they were and perhaps try and get a sense of their making practice or their collecting practices, we discovered very quickly that there were quite stark differences. So George Philip Elphick, who was the most prolific namer of makers, was the most prolific namer because he named himself all the time. He was a caster of bells, and so every time he cast a bell in a tiny church somewhere in the English countryside, he named himself as the maker. And the Pitt-Rivers has thousands of these bells. Then the ones where there was a name recorded in that field. It wasn't just blank, but the name was unknown, was the next greatest number. And then the third one was Beatrice Blackwood, who I'm going to talk about in some detail. She was an early staff member of the Pitt-Rivers Museum, an early anthropologist. And she didn't travel extensively, but she collected prolifically. And what we noticed very quickly as well was that the gap between Beatrice Blackwood's volume of named makers and the next person down the list was quite a significant jump, the difference of 2,000 something and 400 something. And that the third most prolific namer of makers was another female collector, Gigi Crocker-Jones. She didn't have that many attributed makers, but still significant enough for us to notice. So we decided that Beatrice Blackwood was someone worth digging into because there seemed to be something interesting there. And Blackwood was a fascinating woman. She was an early anthropologist. She went to Oxford in the early 1900s and then studied anthropology and went on to collect in Melanesia, Canada, the USA, also in the UK between 1924 and 1928. And after 1928, she didn't collect abroad at all. But during that very brief period, she collected an enormous amount of material that she brought back to the museum. On her return to Oxford, she taught at the university, firstly as a demonstrator and then later as a lecturer in anthropology, and also worked as a cataloger and curator at the museum right up until shortly before she died in 1975. She was known as a stickler for proper documentation, and I think one of the reasons why the Pitt Rivers documentation is so good is in no small part due to her. And most significantly for us, she seemed to have named her makers. Now, when I say named her makers, I think it probably makes sense for me to show you what that means. So this spreadsheet here is an example of objects collected by Beatrice Blackwood. And what we did is we compiled the spreadsheet by combining several fields, those which gave information about where and when an object was collected and by whom, who made it, the source community or cultural group from whom the object was collected. And what we also found was that we had to quite frequently cross-reference this information with information from what is known as the primary documentation field at the Pitt Rivers Museum. Now, the primary documentation is a whole kind of separate entity in and of itself. It's free text, descriptive details, written into the collections documentation by curators and catalogers who've been working with the collection over many years, because obviously that kind of documentation is an ongoing process. You can cross-reference by accession number, but what we realized was for the kind of data exploration that we were doing, which had a lot to do with making comparisons and looking for correlation, the free text nature of that information just made it too difficult. There was no controlled vocabulary. We couldn't tell the computers precisely what to look for. So unfortunately, we had to leave that information out of our data exploration. But as we were preparing the questions, we found ourselves looking back at that fairly frequently. And what we find particularly interesting, what I find particularly interesting here is that Blackwood gives the full names of the children who've created these drawings that she made. And this is extremely unusual from the period. What I also find interesting and worth exploring here is where the information, where these materials were being collected from. So Blackwood recorded the drawings as being made by children who she documented as identified as African-American, Chinese, Navajo, Zuni, Chippewa, Ojibwa, Mexican-American, Sioux, European British, and in some cases simply American. And when we began sorting these results by region, it became evident to us that many of the drawings had been collected on what were at the time, in the 1920s, known as Indian reservations and are now known generally in the US as First Nations reserves, and at residential schools for Indigenous American and Canadian children. Others had less detailed descriptions, such as there were 99 drawings that were made by children described as African American, which were recorded as being collected in Alabama, Montgomery, and over 400 drawings, which were made by children whose cultural group field records them as being Chinese and were collected in California, San Francisco. And for these kinds of items, we found ourselves referring to the primary documentation quite frequently to see if we could find any more details about these particular schools. So as a kind of data-driven breakdown, this is roughly how Blackwood's source communities breakdown. These were the top groups that she collected from, but in total she collected from 65 differently identified cultural groups. Now, at this point, the workshop ended, and we were sort of left with this tantalizing nugget of discovery, but couldn't really be sure of where to go next with it. So I approached the Pitt Rivers Museum and asked them if it would be possible to continue this exploration and find out a little bit more, particularly about this collection of drawings. And what I did was I went on to manually cross-reference the records that we had collated and the primary documentation fields to try and get a little bit more detail. And what I found was that Blackwood collected at about 30 different schools in the USA, Canada, and Britain in the 4 years between 1924 and 1928. And as I said earlier, they were collected on First Nations reservations, residential schools, but also segregated schools, which were set aside for Korean, Chinese, and Japanese migrant children in San Francisco. She also collected in rural settlement schools in Kentucky, and at schools attached to historically Black universities, such as the Fisk University and Tuskegee Institute. And what she did in all of these collecting exercises was she asked the children to draw a man, a woman, and a child. So it was a very specific set of instructions. And I think what I also find particularly interesting is that she has an interest in communities who at the time, I think we could safely consider to be distinctly marginal. So they were either located in remote rural settlements, on reservations, in communities of outsiders, such as immigrants in large cities. And what we see from her notes, which I'll show you a bit more of now, is that for Blackwood, what was of equal significance to the figures represented in the drawings by the children was the social context in which these drawings were created. So by doing this cross-referencing between the primary documentation and the public documentation, the kind of who, what, where documentation, what we can see is that her kind of anthropological eye was very clear in these collecting processes. She had a set of anthropological objectives that she wanted to achieve, and this really shaped how she collected and also where she collected. And I should also add at this point, the primary documentation files are not visible to anyone who visits the Pitt Rivers Museum website. You can go to the Pitt Rivers Museum website, search through their collections online, find most of these materials, but you can't access the primary documentation. You need to approach the museum for special permission to find this information. And also, of the drawings that we're looking at today, very, very few of them are visible on the website. So you can search by accession number and you can pull up kind of bare minimum of text and information about the drawings, but you can't see the actual images themselves. And what I found was that Blackwood really was providing very deep descriptions of some of these drawings that she collected. So, for example, there's a set of drawings by children aged between 7 and 11 who were at a school in Alabama called the Calhoun School. And the Calhoun School was established in the early 1900s as a school for the children of emancipated slaves. And she says, a note with the drawings, which is in the primary documentation file, says, Calhoun School, Lowndes County, Alabama, is a country school drawing from a very poor local agricultural population. Most of these children come from 1 or 2 roomed wooden shacks and have no educational background whatsoever. They spend all their time at home working in the cotton fields. The children who drew this set of drawings are all from the night school at Calhoun School. The night school children are those who have no money to pay for their board, so they work at a trade all day and are paid for it a little more than they need for their board. This is accumulated for them till they have enough to enter the day school. Meanwhile, they study and have classes from 7 until 9 every evening after their day's work. So they are far behind other children of their age. And on the right, there's an image of a carpentry class at the school in about the 1900s. I have to say, I find this little note tucked away sort of behind the layers moving. It gives an enrichment to a set of objects that I think would increase my understanding of these materials and kind of deepen the ways in which we might think about drawings such as these. But what is also interesting is that while context was important for Blackwood, I think the ethical questions were of less of a concern to her, although they're extremely significant today. These drawings, the fact that these drawings were made as part of a school exercise means that we need to consider whether the children were informed about the objectives of what they were being instructed to do. Did they know what the drawings were to be used for? Did they give their permission to have them collected and to have their names and ages recorded, often on the drawings themselves? In some ways, it's this information that makes these drawings exceptional. As several scholars have pointed out, at that time in anthropology, or in Western anthropology in the early 1920s, it was very uncommon for collectors to attribute work to individual makers, since they prioritized pure facts over individual experiences, which resulted in a practice of field collecting that really quite intensely strove to remove any subjective voices of individual creators, and leading to an overall absence of any kind of indigenous voices in museum collection documentation. It seems evident that Blackwood didn't take this view. By naming the children and noting their ages, she marks them out as individuals, which certainly serves a particular anthropological purpose for her, but also provides us with a richer and a deeper set of materials to work with. On the other hand, for the Pitt Rivers Museum, it's exactly these politics that make it pretty much impossible to ever show the images of the drawings or make these richer descriptions found in the primary documentation files available through their portal. The contemporary sensitivities to the privacy of the children and their families, as well as to the contexts in which these objects were collected, require that the publicly accessible information remains extremely scant. And so, to give you an example of what that looks like, on the right, you'll see this is a screenshot of the record and the image of one drawing, which I was able to find. I think when I spoke to the curators, they said to me, well, it could be visible because there's only a first name of the child on the drawing, but it also could just have been a fluke. There could have just been a glitch somewhere in the process. And this is a reminder that algorithmically, it's extremely difficult to manage the specificity required, kind of go through every object when you have hundreds to deal with. These sorts of mistakes do slip through the cracks if it's not intentional, and it can be very difficult to train the computer to perhaps pick up when these sorts of anomalies occur. But the note attached to this drawing and the others of the subset that it's in, the 51 drawings by Navajo school children from what was then known as the US Indian boarding school in Chinle, Arizona. Now, in this case, Blackwood actually sent the drawings on to Professor Arthur Thompson, who was a lecturer in the Department of Human Anatomy, which is where the anthropologists like to hang out at Oxford at the time. And the note says, drawings by children at the US Indian boarding school, Chinle, Arizona. Chinle is 80 miles from the railroad in the heart of the Navajo reservation. The children all come from the reservation and have not been in contact with white people much except for school. Their drawings are typically Navajo in most cases. They have a drawing period in school, but they've never been taught to draw people. The boys said they couldn't draw a man without a picture to copy, and mightn't they draw horses instead? Again, I think we have real detail here, which isn't visible in the online version of this material. And I think in some cases for very good reason, but we need to ask ourselves, what of this information can we share? What of this information could we not share if we were the professionals in this context? So I think of all of the drawings, for me, the most significant subset are the drawings made by children who were in residential schools. In the USA and in Canada, these schools were established to force assimilation and civilization on the children who attended them in what was essentially a long-term attempt to destroy indigenous cultures in North America. In fact, in 1920, so not long before Blackwood went there to collect, the Canadian Deputy Minister of Indian Affairs predicted that in a century, thanks to the work of these schools, they would be able to eliminate the Indian entirely. These schools were sites of physical, sexual, and emotional abuse, as well as illness and malnutrition. And many communities in the USA and Canada consider them to be sites of an explicit Indigenous genocide and cultural loss. Although the Canadian government made a public apology in 2018 on behalf of all Canadians for the school system, this history continues to be a source of significant pain. The history of these institutions and their long-term impact on Indigenous communities is also increasingly being investigated as part of a complex web of structural inequality and violence, which have had long-lasting social, political, and personal implications for the communities affected. Marie Baptiste, a Métis scholar from Canada, writes, the school systems were part of a broader cognitive imperialism through which settler knowledge systems, by means of systemic and structural power, were positioned as exclusively legitimate, while Indigenous knowledge systems were deemed parochial and pushed to the margins of institutionalized education. Now, in the context of the children's drawings at the Pedrippers Museum, it's important to consider this contextual social and political information as it may manifest in the metadata or not, and how as conscious or cognizant curatorial and research staff that might be folded into the system. The school at Alert Bay in British Columbia was one of these residential schools, and as you can see in the text on the left, again, this is Blackwood's note. She says, the children have drawing lessons but have never been taught the human figure in them. They have obviously got their ideas from the illustrated catalogues of the big mail order stores, which are the village's main form of literature. But the drawings were done from memory in class. Some of these children show great skill in drawing native designs, figures of totem poles, etc. Now, Andrea Walsh, who's a Canadian anthropologist who's worked extensively on the art created by survivors of these schools when they were in residence, has argued that sometimes it's necessary to remove these works from the public view for good. And this is a perspective that the Pitt Rivers takes seriously. They are extremely careful to ensure that no identifying information about the makers of the drawings is available via their online collections database. And in thinking about these drawings, it raises the question of not only how to think about this data, but also the many petabytes of data in collections like these around the world. Now, I think if the pandemic has shown us, well, the pandemic has shown us many things, but one of the things it's shown us is that there is a huge demand for interconnected collections that can be accessed from anywhere with ways of drawing in information from different collections that may be geographically and technically quite dispersed. But this kind of information poses a particular problem. It would be unethical to show this information or to discuss perhaps, for example, children attending a residential school like this one in Alert Bay without providing the crucial contextualizing information of what the residential school system was and what it did. But how can data curators balance the appeal of these large-scale sources of curated and computational information with the need for the really detailed, granular attention to the ethics of individual objects? Making such detailed exceptions is almost impossible to manage automatically or algorithmically. But it's really difficult to imagine how, in an increasingly digital future, researchers and institutions might maneuver around these really, I think, explosively powerful objects, which are buried very deep in the collection's record. And so I think to wrap it all up, these are the questions that thinking about these drawings really spark for me. I think there's a set of specific questions about Beatrice Blackwood herself and what her professional intentions were. Beatrice herself as a woman in an overwhelmingly male world at the time, and her political and social context. That there are also the political struggles of the communities from whom she was collecting, and the politics of her subjects, who were children, who are possibly the least empowered when it comes to giving permission and being told what to do. So there's a set of specific political questions, and then there's a broader set of questions around large-scale sources and granular attention, context versus functionality. Computer systems need to be lean in order to be operable and interoperable, but leanness often leaves out context. And then there's also the politics of the institutions that hold this material and of the communities themselves. That's been a bit of a whistle-stop trip. It was quite a dense paper, so I feel I've had to strip quite a bit out for this discussion today. But if anyone is interested, it hasn't been published yet, but if anyone wants to read a copy, just drop me a line and I'm sure we can find a way to make it available. And on that note, I would just like to say thank you very much and open it up to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Rebecca, for that really engaging case study and for your reading of that case study. You leave us with an impossible set of tensions of politics versus ethics, of how do we judge, Rebecca, this researcher Beatrice Blackwood, do we judge her according to the standards of her time or now? How and in what ways do we deal with these problems of ethnography and anthropology, and how do we transfer them smoothly into the digital space so that they're adequately represented and richly enough, contextualized richly enough. And just so many really impossible problems that you leave us with here. I think these are some of the tensions and problems that I know perhaps Deborah and Chloe would be able to speak to a bit more directly as digital archive managers. Chloe and Rebecca, do you want to come up?
Well, I was hoping you had all the answers for us, Dwayne. Now I'm disappointed that you can't answer these questions.
No. Chloe and Deborah certainly have
excellent.
Some of the answers. Some of the answers, especially relating to the capturing of data and the decision-making processes that actually take place at the interface of inserting the contextual metadata that you now consider will be important in the future, and that's also a tricky thing. So Chloe and Deborah, you can come up on screen.
Hi, yeah, we are on screen. Hi, Dwayne, and
awesome.
thanks so much, Rebecca. Yeah, what a wonderful paper. Both Chloe and I both thoroughly enjoyed, and it was great to see also the visuals from your presentation with that. And just to bounce off from where actually Dwayne sort of linked us on saying, talking about the moment of transferring, and then I think he even used the word inserting. And it's amazing how those two words are something that I'm going to pick on, because yesterday Rebecca and I just had a quick chat, and we spoke about the digital moment that happens when a collection or anything is now chosen for digitization, and how if one is not in the work of digitization oneself, if one is in the other realm, the analog realm, or even in just the sort of theoretical realm, and you're wanting the digital, there's kind of that sense of, okay, just digitize it, just digitize it. And in fact, I think that was one of the first things that happened even now in the last week after the tragic fire at Jagger. I think there was just this big sort of, what was digitized, what wasn't digitized. And so we kind of call on it in an emergency sort of situation. I think we also do that with how we record, just generally with our own recording devices nowadays, so many people have got access to cameras and cloud-based technology. And so we're just recording and sort of keeping without sort of much more thought than that. So when you're in the business of the digitizing, that sort of notion of inserting and transferring data, that moment is, and we both concurred yesterday, Rebecca and I, that it's such a it's such an opportune moment, because it's the moment in which the analog data, the analog sort of information is now going to be attended to in some ways for I wouldn't say it's the last time, because, you know, you'll keep accruing digital information. It'll never stop. But in a very specific way, you're now scanning it, you're photographing it, you're starting to build its base of information, its seed, its roots that are going to go out into the World Wide Web. And if you don't pay attention at that point to what you're putting out there, you miss such a chance, and you start a process of having to try and go back and redo. And because there's so much, and because even as in, you know, what Rebecca's shown us, what is put out on the front face onto a catalog, for instance, for the public to see, is just a little tip of information. And because we need to do so much work to actually bring more context in, you can't afford to let that moment go unconscious, we could say. So the fact that you've, you know, the data sprint, I love the idea, by the way. I don't know what the rest of you all think, but I think it's such a fantastic idea to get a whole lot of different people from different disciplines, and then to say, okay, let's do something with this for a couple of days. And it seems like the way you workshopped it was just starting to bring up, you know, the post-it notes, and I think it's fascinating. And the fact that it took you to focus on these drawings, which bring up very specific issues because of the children's identities and the whole situation surrounding these children. But this is just like an entry point to the larger discussion of all the collections that we're going to have to really, that we really ought to do that contextualizing information for before we put them into the web. So yeah, those are just first ramblings, and I'll hand over to colleague Chloe to also say.
Hi. I mean, so a couple of things sort of jumped out at me at first. Our project, I think, in some ways is very difficult for the data scientists, in the sense that we really focus on that contextualizing information. We do use data fields, of course, to put our metadata online, but within those data fields, we have really pushed as far as we can, putting in as much contextualizing information as possible, which is in a lot of ways very important and very, I mean, it's one of the core sort of principles of the project itself, is making sure that all of this information is made visible. But it does then create those problems of, you know, not a completely unified set of terminologies, for example, which I think does create some problems when you are doing something like a data sprint, where you are just using that raw data rather than really like investigating that contextualizing information. So in some ways, our project is difficult in that sense. We do try to mitigate that problem of terminologies in some ways. So if we have variants of certain names, we tend to put all the variants that we have in, you know, in a block of information, to try and make it so that people can kind of draw together those differences in terminologies. But we don't really work on like a tagging system. We don't work on anything like that. We work on a system of maximum searchability. So primarily, you know, putting in a word into a search bar and that word coming up in the data. So it is, I think, a slightly different way of managing metadata to what is traditionally done in museums and in archives as well. And it does, of course, also then bring up a bunch of those ethical questions of how much of that contextualizing information should we make public. So yeah, I think that's very interesting. It's the ethical questions are something that definitely are always on our minds, but I think it's sometimes quite easy to lose it when you are in that process of digitization, in that moment of digitization, even though you don't want to lose it. I think sometimes it is quite an easy oversight to make, especially when you want to provide as much information and as much contextual information as well to the researcher.
Thanks, Chloe, and thanks, Deborah. At this point, I'd like to ask Carolyn to come in, because Carolyn has foregrounded that the FHYA like really wants to make transformative moves at the level of metadata. So, Carolyn, do you just want to come in here for a moment, just speak to these ideas of these transformative moves around metadata?
Sure, Dwayne, but also keen not to take up too much oxygen in this session. So, but I think some of the interest here lies in the matter of how to have a standard vocabulary, how to have the standards, and sometimes to contest the established standards. Because I'm aware that Chloe and Deborah constantly contest the standards, so they insist on the standards to an extent that makes the historian me, a little bit, well, I think, well, no, but we can just add this, but right. So they insist on the standards, but then they contest them. And one of the contestations that I think they've put in place that have been quite remarkable is to develop the category that they call makers and shapers. And by putting just that simple move, getting a category in, makers and shapers, sometimes you can shift the discussion away from the original collection's own notion of primacy. So the original collection often has the collector as the primary producer, actually. So by having makers and shapers, they're able to do that. Then as more information is collected by scholars working on a collection or something of that nature, they've opened up a section in the project where that can be contributed. And then it can be, as makers and shapers are discerned, then they can be added into the metadata. And so there's a scholarly and even a general public accretive possibility. So I think all those questions are really the opportunities that happen at what I think Deborah's saying is this moment when you decide actually on the system, because the system and the standards that you put in are going to control so much. So it's not even simply the decisions about whether to put something online or not, or even how to do it, but actually which system will you do? Does the system allow you to do what you feel you need to do? Thanks, Dwayne.
Thanks so much for that, Carolyn. I think we need to just take one little step back so that our audience understands exactly what system that we're building here. So Deborah, do you just want to say a little bit very briefly about what is the 500-year archive? Like what is the system that you're building? Is it a Google search engine? What is the 500-year archive?
Okay, Dwayne, I'll try and give what do they call it? An elevator. What do they call it? Elevator version.
Elevator pitch.
An elevator pitch. And if I stumble, Chloe, jump in. But the 500-year archive basically tried to get, well, we've got 10 collaborating partnership institutions that have given us permission to select and then to showcase online together in one place their collections. And so we basically made one place, a multi-repository site. So we've got 10 different institutions, but now all searchable in one place. And we chose a very small geographical area in KwaZulu-Natal, and we try to focus on the area on a time frame of sort of 500 years prior to the colonial events. And we did this because there is so much sort of, there's a lot of material, but there's a dearth of information about the material. The provenance is very scant and sometimes incorrect. And so therefore, because it didn't fit into the regular archive, it was sort of deemed unarchivable. But in fact, there is a whole incredible rich archive of material long before the word with the capital A, archive, arrived here. So we're just trying to assemble the material in one place and give as much contextual information. That is our major, as Carolyn has said, it's like the metadata surrounding the objects is the project as such, and not so much just the object that is now from the collection and now being put online, but we are interrogating all the archival records and devices that are used, the apparatus, you could call them, the accession registers, the index cards, the object labels, any notes that are flying, you know, even the boxes, the labels on the boxes, old boxes, new boxes, tape covers, anything that has been sort of traveling with this object by way of actual physicality or textual documentation is being put together for scrutiny in one file. So instead of just opening a series and getting an object and getting some information about it, like you would say with that children's drawing, that child's drawing you showed us, now you'd be able to see the child's drawing. You'd also be able to see the index card for the child's drawing. You'd be able to then see the accession register. You'd be able to see some of the notes and correspondence that maybe the anthropologist had in order to go to that school, to go and get that. And then you'd be able to start to form a picture without us having to then impose too much on it. So sorry, that's not such a good elevator pitch. It was a very high building. We were okay.
So part of the project, as Deborah was saying, is making the archival apparatus itself an archived object. So as Deborah said, boxes, index cards, accession registers, anything that we really could get our hands on that that touched the object in some way. And in that makers and shapers record, then we have as much information as we can about the person who made it, if we can. That's been very difficult. A lot of this material, that provenance is not recorded, and it's been quite difficult to try and figure out where and when we can put names to things and how we can find those names, and how, if we do have names, how we can find biographical information if possible. So we have the original sort of maker of an object, but we also have the collector, of course. But then, you know, the museums that have housed it, when those museums have changed, have the hands shifted. And if we have any information further than that, so for example, we have the Swaziland Oral History Project, which Carolyn worked on when she was very small. We have as much information as we can about not only the people who were interviewed, not only the interviewers, but also the people who transcribed, the people who translated, and so on and so forth, so that we can, as much as possible, try and provide that contextualizing information, more so than just, you know, a note about the time that it was recorded or something like that, but really try to showcase how this information was collected, why it was collected, and how the context of that information has changed over time.
If I may jump in.
Yeah, like I was just going to say.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, I think what's so exciting about this project is that you're able, or you're really doing what I think very few archivists have done or have had the opportunity to do in the past, which is to really think about kind of the future proofing of this archive, in terms of saying, well, we don't know what the scholars in 10, 20, 120 years time are going to want. So we're going to give them as much as we possibly can. And I think that to archive materials with that thought in mind is crucial, because otherwise that's how stuff gets left out. And I think in some ways, all the kind of like super fancy technical stuff that people talk about with, you know, semantic connections and neural networks and, you know, pattern recognition for free text fields and blah, 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 that's actually a kind of retrofit where they're trying to do, you know, retrospectively what it is that you guys are building into the system right now, which I just think is unbelievably exciting. It's so cool.
Yeah, I think the fact that it's experimental has been just such a liberating springboard, because, you know, if you're trying to build if you have to digitize your archive, if you're a museum and now you've got to get all your things, you know, ducks in a row and get it happening, you've got a timeline. I think it's, yeah, you've got to think about all these things and make these decisions really consciously, really probably quickly. But I think what we've been lucky with, and I'm hoping that over time, and it's already is proving to be something like this, where the sort of troubleshooting and the problems that we're coming up against, and what would you call them, the ups and downs of it all, and the real sort of affordances and the pitfalls of what we're learning. You know, we hope to sort of at least just be able to then chat with people and consult with people that are doing this work, just so that we can, you know, there's definitely certain things that one immediately sort of comes up against, and how to know what to look for, how to deal with it. I mean, we definitely don't have all the answers, but the fact that we're experimenting all the time, and we're not being held to sort of, okay, you've made this digital archive, means that, I mean, we have even now moved from one system to another, and that's, you know, just in the last year. I think I should probably give a little bit of background on the fact that we started using an open source software initially. You know, we took a while from the pilot project, before I was even involved, to try and sort of decide what sort of description software we would use as such, you know. And we definitely wanted one that was open source, and we chose we looked at Omeka, a lot of museums and galleries use, but we decided to go for one called Atom. It's made by a company called Artifactual in Canada, and it stands for Access to Memory, and it's an archival description software, which what it did nicely for us was it gave a real archival hierarchy, which we wanted to give the objects that had never, the collectors that had never been given archival status. We wanted to sort of, it's almost like there's that saying, you've got to get in to get out. In some ways, we wanted to put it into the setting so that it could be then searched with other things that were in the capital A archival setting. And we wanted to have that opportunity. But once you put it there, you can see the constraints of it. And especially coming from the North and not really understanding or sort of having a place for a lot of what I think we're needing here as far as metadata factors go. We've had a long road of we tried to customize it at first, and we did. One of the big interventions we made, I would say, is that we allowed for public input, which meant that you could log in, obviously free of charge. You just have a small profile saying there were no conditions on that, didn't have to be a historian or professional. And then you could comment on any one of the pages. So if you came across something in the archive, in a museum somewhere, or in a, you know, and you could see that this information was incorrect, maybe, you know, this was something that you, even in your like familial, you knew it. You could go in there and say, no, this is actually wrong. This is da-da-da. Comment. And then you could also upload anything that you felt relevant to that. So you say, oh, I've done a thesis on this, really important. Oh, I've read this book. And then you'd actually upload the file, any kind of media. And then when you searched that record, you would find that comment with that amendment made by somebody, made by a person, a member of the public, anybody. And I think that's also the thing, is we're trying to stop the gatekeeping of, you know, this is where, you know, you have to come, and then maybe we'll allow you. The fact that the fact that it's called primary documentation, I mean, and then it's not allowed out is just quite something.
I do think that is that really bumps up against that ethical question of what we should and should not make available, because of course there are these very complex ethical questions about consent from children, for example, consent from people who had to give information in a very marginalized setting under very specific circumstances. But where is that, keeping that information at, you know, behind closed doors? Where is that gatekeeping? Where is that saying, okay, well, this information we can look at in the museum at Oxford, we can do it, but the general public cannot, and where, you know, we need to be very conscious about where we're being ethical in our choices of things to hold back, and where we are slipping into that process of, well, the general public's not really quite ready for this information, or won't understand the complex political issues behind this information. And so, you know, so it's a very, as Dwayne said, it's a very, very complex, unanswerable in some ways question. And definitely, I mean, your paper was so interesting, and it brought up so many really, really important questions and thoughts that I had not necessarily thought consciously. So yeah, I think it's a very interesting kind of dynamic between those two things.
So in the spirit of the FHYA and the possibilities for public commentary on the records that we have, I'd like to open up for questions. You can either drop your questions in the chat box. I see Katie Garren is here, also worked with the FHYA team, and now is the archivist at the Jewish Museum here in Cape Town. Katie, do you want to come in and pose a question on camera, on stage?
To have a look at my
Welcome,
hair.
Katie.
Cool. It's been so interesting, guys. Like we all feel so like I worked with Deborah and Chloe like a few years ago, and it's so nice to see everyone, because like I was saying to my colleague Layla, couldn't join us. She had an interview for a documentary. But like we feel like Layla and I sit and bounce these questions off each other all the time with the kinds of complex metadata we have in the Jewish Digital Archive project, which has different challenges, right? It's like I said in this comment, or this that the Jewish memory is long and wide, and it goes all the way back to, you know, the Jewish people that came here from Lithuania. The kids sit in Herzliya and create family trees from the age of 8 and 9. They know their heritage, they know their history. As soon as you say, oh, so-and-so, you know, they see my surname, oh, you must know this Karen and this Karen and this Karen and this Karen. So everything's so interconnected that the metadata is never ending, because if you put something up, a community member will say, oh no, but I remember Abraham Levy, and he, you know, said this and he did this, and you know, what's anecdotal that you can include. It's all interesting, but like you say, how much can you make public to keep everybody happy, to make it interesting, to describe, you know, we don't have artifacts, we've got photographs, we've got documents, we've got correspondence, we've got film and interviews. Some can be self-explanatory to an extent, but the work of metadata just seems to never ever be done. There's always more historical information to add, and at what point do we stop? Also, this is the thing, we also use Atom and you know, free language metadata. And then you got to have the standards, you know, C point with a space between C and point, without a space, then what comes up, what doesn't come up, you know, these connecting, these standards, all these kinds of things. So it's all just questions, and it's me and Layla, when it's just us bouncing it off each other, we start to feel in our little silos. So just the more of this we can have, the better, because this just helps. That's great. So thank you so much, Rebecca, and everyone. It's been very cool.
I mean, I think in part, Katie, the answer to that question is it doesn't stop. We can't ever stop working with the metadata and producing the metadata. I mean, I think, yeah, JDAP also works very much on that community engagement kind of a platform, which is amazing, and I think provides so much interesting, meaty stuff to work with. So, but yeah, it just doesn't stop. We just never stop working. We'll all be sat here in like the year 2051, just typing away.
Yeah.
Thanks so much, Katie. I see that Carolyn has a hand up. Carolyn, would you like to pose a question to Rebecca?
Yeah, I'd love to pose a question to Rebecca. I really enjoyed the paper. Thanks so very much. So look, you know, you make this important point about the metadata being politics. And we also realized from your paper that you are understanding the politics of, I'm sorry, I can't remember the anthropologist who was also the curator's name, but this woman's own politics of the time, and then there's the politics of the collection itself. And then I'm thinking about what these objects are available digitally in various institutions. And maybe the point doesn't apply with the purchase that it could, because we're dealing with the children's stuff and the a real ethical complication there. But let's say we're not dealing with that. Now it's available, stuff's available in a collection. It's there, and it's prized by the Pitt Rivers Museum and by Oxford University and so on, because at the time when it was being put together, it was seen as absolutely fundamental to the epistemological project. So we are, without a doubt in my mind, on a point of epistemological rupture. We are transitioning in a major sort of a way. Transition may be too soft a word. So actually, as the alternative epistemological projects come into view, they want different collectors. So I'm wondering if there isn't a process of secondary collection that's now happening off the back of these institutional collections, such that people with an epistemological vision can put stuff together in new ways. Maybe not necessarily, I mean, the critical point about this digital stuff is it's not, you don't have to own the original to reassemble. And I'm wondering if that isn't one of the dimensions of that you're pointing to, that in a way you started to do that. Because you started to kind of assemble slightly differently. And I could see that you could well take all of that even further, and you did actually, because actually we saw a photograph that you found, I think, or someone found from Harvard. So, you know, so actually there's a different epistemological project now driving a different assemblage, your assemblage with your signature. And I wonder, you know, what happens there to that? You know, okay, that's my, thanks.
Yeah, that's such a great question. I don't think I've ever thought of anything that I do as assemblage, but thank you for that. It feels quite nice. I mean, I can't help thinking of these kind of unified collections that are beginning to emerge now, these big infrastructures that pull together materials from so many different collections. And the one that really comes to mind for me is the European Holocaust Research Infrastructure, where what they've done is they've pulled, you know, in Holocaust research, it's very difficult to get complete sets because the materials are so dispersed. And they're pulling together materials from archives in Poland and archives in Germany and the Shoah Foundation in the States, and kind of really creating these digitized assemblages with a whole set of complexities and difficulties around data protection and, you know, hiding people's names. And, oh, I just found out that my grandpa was a Nazi. Like, what do I do with that information? Well, we're going to make that information public, but you can't, but you can. You know, it's so complicated. And I think that if we're going to talk about the assemblages that we are all making all the time in the context of those sort of, not only the big infrastructures that exist, but just the way we cruise through the internet, pulling stuff together all the time. I think for someone like Blackwood, it says to me that the moment is ripe for her to become seen as a kind of agent, not just as a collector or as someone who kind of worked behind the scenes to bring things together, but really as almost as someone who needs to be excavated too. You know, I want to know why she collected those drawings. I want to know why she went to the places that she did. And, you know, she collected in Papua New Guinea in the 1920s, which was an extremely unusual thing to do. And no one's written the book about Beatrice Blackwood yet, but I think if they were to, and if that book were to become maybe like the node that then sits in that archive and then connects out to really give us more insight into these drawings and into the other things that she collected as well. Perhaps the kind of epistemological rupture that you mentioned might be in a sort of pivot of attention from the object to the collector, and then from the collector to the maker, that the center of focus moves outwards a little bit from the materials to the acts and the people who were the agents behind the acts. Maybe, don't know.
So one of the things that we're doing now, whilst we're moving into our new system, whilst not completely setting aside our old system, because it still is there for a lot of different reasons, but whilst moving into this new system, which we're calling Imandulo, part of the sort of thinking behind how we've reassembled that information, because originally we, on Atom, Atom is very repository based. So everything is housed very specifically in the repositories that they came from. And as Deborah said, so it's searchable across the whole site. So those things are naturally gathered together when people are searching, but they are still siloed into their own institutions, and for some, sometimes for good reason. So, for example, with all of that contextualizing information, you also need to have information about the institution, right? But when we moved sort of to this other system, we tried to recontextualize that information. We tried to reconvene it in a different way that wasn't as focused on the repository. And the way we started thinking about it was sort of the shaping event, rather than these collections in the repository or these collections in the repository. So that is sort of how we are trying to think about material at the moment, is through the eyes of sort of the shaping event. And in some ways that's extremely broad, and in other ways that's extremely narrow, depending on the material and depending on sort of the way even we are thinking about that material in particular. So for example, we have a very broad sort of collection of material surrounding Mgugudlovu, which primarily is centered around the excavation processes that happened there from the 1970s through to the late 1990s. There was quite a lot of excavation work done, and that's sort of the event perhaps that we are thinking about. But of course, that's so much broader than that, and we have so much more information still coming to light from working with this material. But yeah, we're trying to move away from sort of that very specific institutional structure to one where we're thinking more about the events that happen and why things are collected, which I think is really interesting. And it's been a really fascinating and fun way to work with the material. It's really exciting to rework with this material that we've worked with for so long and kind of think about it in new ways. So, which goes back again to the idea of A, the experimental, and B, the fact that the process of metadata management is never done.
Awesome, thanks so much, Chloe. And we have I think we have 5 minutes or so left. I would like to ask the audience to stay just for 1 or 2 minutes extra at the end. But at this point, I'd like to invite Karen Ijumba, who has a question as well. I think you have a question for Rebecca, Karen. You're welcome to come up on the screen.
Not so much for Rebecca, but for Deborah and Chloe. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. We can hear you.
Hi, Deborah. And
hey,
hi,
Karen.
Nina also. How are you doing?
Yeah, good. Nice to hear you again.
Good. Nice to hear you too, and I'm happy that you're sitting on the other side of this. Rebecca, I think there's such an important thing that came up in your presentation. I'm very hurriedly going to read your paper after I finish with this session. But I think what you brought to the fore quite nicely is how Blackwood's worldview kind of curated what she saw in the communities that she went into. So a lot of her lens was shaped by her race, by her gender, her own, the period in which she was functioning, her ethnicity, etc. And I think Deborah and Chloe also, I think you know when you're sitting in front of kind of material and digitizing it, when you're doing the transferring and inserting, you're also kind of sometimes limited to your worldview or your world experience when you're inserting these things into the collection, and digitally also. So I was just curious to know, how much does the maximum searchability of the free language data, how much does it mitigate against just the digital archivists and worldview being the thing that limits how much we know about an item or an object in the digital collection? And are there further ways of doing that? Like, has somebody come up to you and said, yeah, I can tell the thing was thrown by a white female who grew up in a certain period or whatever, or does that kind of disappear if you put in these measures like maximum searchability or free language browser? That's my question.
I think that if I can answer, and then I'll hand it back to Chloe, is that I think that most importantly is the transparency, right? Because as you say, somebody with their view is putting that information in. And I was thinking about it a lot while I was reading the paper and while I was listening to Rebecca's presentation, is that there's otherwise an invisible person, a middleman as such, right, between these processes. So there were invisible people in the collections themselves because the collectors forefronted. And now when this is moving to digital, there's another invisible person, which happens to be the digital archivist in some cases. And as I even said in the chat, you know, people are learning on the job. There aren't actually qualifications to be had in South Africa for a digital archivist. You can learn digital curation, you can do a sort of higher degree in that, and you can be an archivist, a librarian, or you can be a computer scientist, but where's that bridge? So you've got people that aren't actually sort of like, you know, subject librarians or historians like myself, dealing with the material. So the way we deal with it is that we always attribute where the information is coming from. So if we've taken something from an index card, we're trying to transcribe it as such, we'll say where the index card is from. If we can say who made the index card in the first place, and then we'll even say who actually is putting this information in. So it'll say, you'll see Chloe Rashovich's name is actually all over, and you can see that Chloe is Chloe Rashovich. And although she's not, I mean, you could argue whether Chloe's putting her view into it or not, because we've decided on sort of, I would say, a conceptual framework that tries to honor the sort of maximum information, just including or as the maximum primary information as ethically as possible, as is ethically possible, shall I say, putting it forward and then saying who put it there and at what time. And I think that that's still, at least, is putting a name to a normal invisible person that cannot be implicated normally. If we want to use the word implicated or just, you know, attributed to. So I don't know if that helps somewhat, Karen.
I mean, I think in some ways the maximum searchability definitely lends itself to not taking away that, you know, that influence, because of course it is always there. And I mean, what is very fascinating about working in a project like this is there is, as Carolyn said, there are standards and then there are constant questionings of those standards. And because it's experimental in nature, we are very influenced and influencing that data. But in some ways, I would say that the maximum searchability of it does allow for at least a questioning of that influence, because we, as Deborah said, we do try and attribute as much as possible. So down to the titling of objects. So if I've titled an object, you know, stone pot or something, I don't, you know, whatever, I will say that, you know, we have a section for who titled the object, and it will be Chloe Rashovich for the FHYA using material provided by the KwaZulu-Natal Museum. So we do try and kind of create that transparency, but in some ways, I think there's such a vulnerability as well to creating that transparency that we maybe haven't created. I mean, I think it does lend itself to a question of, do we need even more transparency? Which I think is a difficult question, because there is that vulnerability of how much of the archivist do you put up in the archival project? But I think it's a very interesting question. I think that contextualizing information about us itself is important. I do think that's
Thanks for that last remark, Chloe. All of these impossible tensions, these difficulties of future-proofing your archive, working yeah, working with these problems on the job, having to make really difficult calls at the terminal with this information available to you. Like really interesting problems, Rebecca. Do you want to maybe take 1 or 2 minutes to make a last set of remarks, perhaps, for things that have come up for you, or things that sit with you? I think this is a conversation that we definitely should take up going forward in different ways. Some kind of research group of sorts, digital archival research group. And I think we should also definitely explore the idea of a data sprint. I was also provoked by that idea of a data sprint, and I think we should try and organize some kind of data sprint perhaps later on in the year. But Rebecca, thank you so much, and yeah, you have some of the last remarks.
Thank you. Yeah, it's been such a pleasure to hear about approaches that are taking place at the 500-year archive project, which I've watched from afar, but I'm now going to start poking my nose into things, I think, a little bit more. I hope you don't mind. But I suspect that there is a lot to learn from what's happening there. And I think, as Deborah mentioned, the incredible value of taking an approach to something which says this is experimental. It's not going to be the be all and end all. It's not going to be the archetype or the kind of canonical anything. It's going to be small, and it's going to take some chances, and we're going to see what happens. That approach, in fact, in some ways, like the data sprint approach, really does free you up to try things, to see what happens, to take risks that perhaps might not otherwise be taken. And I think there's enormous value to be had in a process like that, and an enormous amount of learning that others can take from it. So yeah, I think the only thing I would say at the end of this hour and a half is how incredibly grateful I am to have learned so much and to have been able to have this conversation with such smart people who are thinking about such difficult questions. It's a real delight. So thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you so much for your time, for coming in, for zooming in with us, for sharing your work with us, and presenting a really stimulating and provocative set of questions, and something that makes a real interesting fit. And it's wonderful to have your voice in the conversations that we're having. Yesterday, you were in another APC discussion. So please, you are warmly welcomed here at both the CCA and if I can, at the APC as well.